The stranger's hand trembled as he reached for the whiskey bottle, blood still dripping from his knuckles onto the rough-hewn counter of Murphy's trading post. 3 men lay unconscious behind him, victims of a fight that had erupted over a card. Game gone wrong. You look tired. Mr. Wanna meet my ma? The voice belonged to a girl no more than 19, with wild auburn hair that caught the lamplight like flames and eyes the color of summer storms. She stood in the doorway, seemingly unbothered by the chaos around her, a basket of wildflowers clutched in one dirt-stained hand. Caspian Holt turned slowly, his weathered face bearing fresh cuts from the brawl. At 35, he'd seen enough violence to last 3 lifetimes, but something in this girl's fearless gaze made him pause. Most folks crossed the street when they saw him coming, a drifter with a reputation that preceded him through every dusty town from Missouri to California. Your ma might not take kindly to bloody strangers, girl, he said, his voice gravelly from too many years of hard living. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall but carried herself like she owned the world, stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Name's Cordelia Ashworth, and May's seen worse than a few scratches. Besides, she glanced at the groaning men on the floor, looks like they started it. Caspian studied her face, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way she didn't flinch when his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. In all his wandering years, he'd never met anyone quite like this strange, fearless creature who spoke to dangerous men as if they were lost puppies. Why? He asked simply. Cordelia tilted her head, considering. Because you got sad eyes, mister. And because ain't nobody should be alone when they're hurting. She held up her basket. Besides, these flowers need tending, and May makes the best cornbread in 3 counties. You look like you ain't had a proper meal in weeks. The truth was, Caspian hadn't had a home-cooked meal in over 2 years. He'd been running from ghosts and memories, drifting from town to town with nothing but his horse, his guns, and a growing emptiness in his chest that no amount of whiskey could fill. I ain't good company, he warned, though something in him was already reaching toward the warmth in her voice like a man dying of cold reaching for fire. Cordelia laughed, a sound like silver bells in a storm. Mister, if I wanted good company, I'd talk to the preacher. I'm offering you supper and a place to rest your bones that ain't the ground or a jail cell. Outside, thunder rumbled across the prairie, promising rain. Caspian looked at this impossible girl who'd appeared like some wild spirit in the midst of his violence and chaos, offering kindness without asking questions. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest that wasn't rage or grief. Name's Caspian Holt, he said finally, touching the brim of his hat. And I reckon I could use some of that cornbread. Cordelia grinned, revealing teeth white as prairie daisies. Then come on, Caspian Holt. Ma's gonna want to hear about how you laid out Jake Morrison and his boys. She never did like bullies. As she turned toward the door, Caspian realized he was about to follow this strange, wonderful girl into whatever came next. For a man who'd spent years running from his past, it felt like the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. The Ashworth homestead sat like a jewel against the rolling hills, its weathered clapboard house, surrounded by gardens that bloomed with impossible abundance despite the harsh prairie climate. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the warm glow of oil lamps beckoned through rain-streaked windows as Caspian followed Cordelia up the muddy path. Ma, got company, Cordelia called, pushing through the front door with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted her welcome anywhere. The woman who emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron, was nothing like what Caspian had expected. Minerva Ashworth couldn't have been much past 40, with the same wild auburn hair as her daughter, though hers was tamed into a loose bun, and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who'd faced life's storms and emerged stronger. She was beautiful. In the way of weathered things, old barns and sunset skies and mountain peaks that had stood against wind and time. Cordelia rose. You can't just— Minerva's words died as she took in the sight of the blood-stained stranger dripping rainwater onto her clean floor. Her hand moved to the rifle leaning against the doorframe, but her eyes held curiosity rather than fear. This here's Caspian Holt, Ma. He tangled with Jake Morrison's gang at Murphy's and came out on top. Figured he could use some of your cornbread. And maybe some tending to those cuts. Caspian removed his hat, water cascading from its brim. Ma'am, I don't want to impose. Your daughter was kind enough to— Cordelia's always bringing home strays. Minerva interrupted, but her voice held warmth. Last month it was a 3-legged dog, week before that a wounded hawk. Suppose a battered man ain't much different. She studied his face with those storm-gray eyes. You running from something, Mr. Holt? The directness of the question caught him off guard. Most folks danced around such things, but Minerva Ashworth seemed to have no patience for pretense. Yes. Ma'am, been running for quite some time. She nodded as if she'd expected the answer. Well, running's hard work, makes a man hungry. Cordelia, fetch the medical supplies while I set another place at the table. As they moved through the house, Caspian noticed details that spoke of a life lived fully despite hardship. Books lined. Makeshift shelves, their spines worn from frequent reading. A piano, an impossible luxury on the frontier, sat in the corner, its keys yellowed but well maintained. Cordelia's wildflowers filled mason jars throughout the rooms, bringing the prairie's beauty indoors. My husband built that piano crate himself, Minerva said, catching his gaze. Took him 3 years to save up for the parts, another 2 to put it together. Said every home needed music. Her voice carried the weight of loss without bitterness. He's passed? Caspian asked gently. Fever took him 2 winters ago. Left me with Cordelia and this land and enough debt to choke a horse. Minerva ladled stew into wooden bowls, the rich aroma making Caspian's stomach growl audibly. We've managed well enough, though some folks think a woman alone is easy prey. That why Jake Morrison was bothering you? Minerva's laugh held an edge sharp as broken glass. Jake Morrison's been sniffing around since before my husband died, thinking he could intimidate us into selling. He hasn't met many women like Cordelia. And me. As if summoned by her name, Cordelia appeared with bandages and a bottle of something that smelled strong enough to clean wounds or strip paint. Sit still, Caspian Holt. This'll sting, but Maya always says pain's just weakness leaving. The body. Her touch was gentle despite her tough words, fingers soft as she cleaned the cuts on his face and hands. Caspian found himself studying her features, the determined set of her mouth, the way her eyebrows drew together in concentration, the small scar on her chin that spoke of childhood adventures. How'd you know I wasn't dangerous? He asked as she worked. Cordelia glanced up, meeting his eyes. Dangerous men don't apologize for bleeding on clean floors. They don't remove their hats when meeting ladies. And they sure don't get that look in their eyes like lost children when someone offers them kindness. Minerva set bowls of stew before them, along with cornbread that was indeed the finest Caspian had ever tasted. As rain drummed against the windows and lamplight painted the kitchen in warm gold, he felt something in his chest, something that had been frozen for years, begin to thaw. What are you running from, Mr. Holt? Minerva asked again, settling into her chair with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for truth. For the first time in 2 years, Caspian found himself wanting to answer. I killed a man who didn't deserve killing, Caspian said, his spoon halfway to his mouth, the words falling into the warm kitchen like stones into still water. Neither woman flinched. Cordelia continued eating as if he'd mentioned the weather, while Minerva simply nodded and waited for him to continue. His name was Benjamin Cross. Good man, family man. Had a wife who baked pies for church socials and twin boys who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Caspian set down his spoon, his appetite suddenly gone despite the hunger that had gnawed at him for days. I was wearing a badge then. Town of Riverside hired me to clean up their outlaw problem. The rain outside seemed to intensify, matching the storm building in his chest. Cross got caught up with the wrong crowd, borrowed money from them when his crops failed, couldn't pay it back. They made him help with a bank robbery, told him they'd kill his family if he refused. Cordelia's hand moved across the table, her fingers brushing his knuckles. The touch was light as butterfly wings, but it grounded him, gave him strength to continue. I tracked the gang to an old line shack up in the hills. Found Cross standing guard outside while the others divided the money. He had a gun in his hands. But when he saw me, he just looked relieved. Like he'd been waiting for someone to end his nightmare. Minerva leaned forward, her gray eyes intent. What happened? He started to surrender. Was lowering his weapon when shots rang out from inside the shack. One of the bullets took Cross in the back, spun him around. His gun went off as he fell. Caspian's voice grew thick. The bullet caught me in the shoulder. Nothing serious, but my horse spooked. Threw me hard. When I came to, Cross was dead and the gang was gone. So how is it you killed him? Cordelia asked, her voice soft but insistent. Because when the townspeople arrived, they found me standing over his body with my gun drawn. Found his gun empty and mine with one round fired. In all the confusion, with blood loss and a concussion, I couldn't remember clearly what had happened. All I knew was a good man was dead, and somehow it was my fault. Caspian stood abruptly, pacing to the window where rain streaked the glass. Like tears, the town branded me a murderer. Cross's wife spat in my face at the trial. Said I'd robbed her boys of their father and her of the only man she'd ever loved. But if you didn't kill him, Cordelia began. Doesn't matter what I did or didn't do. Matters what people believe. And in their minds, I'm the man who shot Benjamin Cross in cold blood. He turned back to face them, his face etched with 2 years of guilt and running. So I've been drifting ever since, trying to outrun a ghost that follows me everywhere. The kitchen fell silent except for the rhythm of rain and the soft crackle of the fire. Caspian waited for them to ask him to leave, to refuse him shelter. Now that they knew what he was, a man with blood on his hands and a price on his head. Instead, Minerva stood and moved to the stove, returning with a fresh cup of coffee that she pressed into his hands. Guilt's a heavy burden to carry alone, she said simply, but running from it won't make it any lighter. Cordelia rose and took his face in her small hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. You didn't kill that man, Caspian Holt. I can see it in you clear as morning light. A killer doesn't carry the kind of pain you're carrying. A killer doesn't get that broken look when he talks about another man's children. How can you be so sure? Because I've seen killers, real ones. They came through here last spring, burned out the Henderson place, killed old Henrik just for sport. There's a coldness in men like that, an emptiness where their souls should be. You got pain, yes, and guilt enough to drown a horse, but you got warmth too. Got kindness. A killer don't rescue wildflowers from storms or worry about bleeding on a woman's clean floor. Minerva nodded her agreement. Besides, if you were truly guilty, you wouldn't be running. You'd be drinking yourself to death in some saloon or eating your gun in some nameless canyon. Guilty men don't spend 2 years torturing themselves over one mistake. Caspian felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking but opening, like ice giving way to spring water. For the first time since that terrible day in Riverside, someone believed in his innocence without question or condition. What do I do now? He asked, the question coming out like a prayer. Cordelia smiled, and in that smile was all the fierce hope of prairie wildflowers blooming after drought. Now you stop running. Now you stay and help us fight Jake Morrison and his boys. Now you remember what it feels like to belong somewhere." Outside, the storm began to break, and the first tentative rays of sunlight pierced the clouds like promises of better days to come. 3 days after Caspian's arrival, Jake Morrison arrived with 5 men and a piece of paper he claimed gave him legal right to the Ashworth land. He sat his horse in the yard like a conquering king, his pale eyes fixed on Minerva as she stood on the porch with a rifle cradled in her arms. "Morning, Mrs. Ashworth. Come to collect on overdue debts." Morrison was a big man gone soft around the middle, with a kind of pale skin that burned rather than tanned, and thin hair he combed over his balding crown. But his eyes held a cruelty that made dangerous men step aside. "My husband's debts died with him, Morrison. You know that, and I know that." Morrison smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Afraid that ain't how the law sees it. Got a judgment here from Judge Pembroke in the county seat. Says this land now belongs to Morrison Holdings to settle outstanding loans." He waved the paper like a flag of conquest. Caspian stepped onto the porch beside Minerva, his hand resting on his gun butt. He'd spent the last 3 days helping repair storm damage and learning the rhythms of the homestead. Working alongside Cordelia in the gardens, listening to Minerva read aloud in the evenings, sleeping in the barn loft surrounded by the honest smells of hay and horses. It was the closest thing to peace he'd known in years. Funny thing about Judge Pembroke, Caspian said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Last I heard, he was facing federal charges for taking bribes. Seems his judgments ain't worth the paper they're printed on." Morrison's face flushed red above his collar. "And who might you be, stranger?" "Name's Caspian Holt. I'm helping the ladies with some repair work." "Caspian Holt," Morrison repeated slowly, recognition dawning in his pale eyes. "The killer. Got a bounty on your head, don't you? $500 dead or alive." Caspian felt Minerva stiffen beside him, but her rifle never wavered. "Bounty or no bounty, he's under our protection," she said firmly. Morrison laughed, the sound ugly as breaking glass. "Your protection? Woman, you're about to be homeless." "I'm being generous, giving you till sundown to pack your belongings. After that, this place gets torched and you get dragged off my land." "Over my dead body," Cordelia said, stepping out of the house with her father's old shotgun in her hands. At 19, she looked like an avenging angel with her wild hair catching the morning light and her storm gray eyes blazing with fury. Morrison's gaze lingered on her in a way that made Caspian's blood boil. Pretty little thing, like you could find herself a comfortable situation if she was nice to the right people. "I got a big house in town, could use some domestic help." The shotgun in Cordelia's hands clicked as she cocked both hammers. "I'd rather burn in hell than sweep your floors, Jake Morrison." "Careful, girl. That mouth of yours is gonna get you in trouble." "No," Caspian said, stepping down from the porch with deadly calm. "You threatening these women is gonna get you in trouble." Morrison's men shifted nervously in their saddles. They'd heard stories about Caspian Holt, about the bodies he'd left scattered across 3 territories before disappearing into legend. Seeing him now lean and dangerous as a drawn blade, his eyes cold as winter sky, they remembered why smart men crossed the street when they saw him coming. 5 against 1, Holt. I like those odds." "Then you can't count." The voice came from the barn, where Jeremiah Pike stepped into view with a rifle in his hands. Pike was Minerva's neighbor, a grizzled old rancher who'd lost his wife to the same fever that took Cordelia's father. Behind him came 3 more men settlers who'd heard about Morrison's intimidation tactics and decided they'd seen enough. "This is still my land," Morrison snarled, but some of the confidence had leaked out of his voice. "No," Minerva said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fought for every inch of ground she stood on. This is Ashworth land. Has been for 8 years. Will be long after you're nothing but bones and Boot Hill. Now get off my property before I let Caspian show you what he learned in all those other towns." Morrison's eyes darted between Caspian's steady gaze and the growing number of rifles pointed in his direction. He was a bully and a coward, the kind of man who only fought when he was sure of winning. "This ain't over," he said, wheeling his horse around. "I'll be back with the sheriff and proper papers. See how brave you feel when the law's on my side." As Morrison and his men rode away, Caspian felt Cordelia's hand slip into his. Her palm was warm and calloused from work, and she squeezed his fingers with quiet strength. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for what? For staying. For not running. When things got dangerous." Caspian looked at this impossible girl who'd changed everything simply by asking if he wanted to meet her ma, and realized that for the first time in 2 years he had something worth fighting for. "Nowhere else I'd rather be," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. That evening, as sunset painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Caspian found Cordelia in her flower garden behind the house. She was kneeling among the wildflowers, her hands gentle as she tended blooms that seemed to grow more beautiful under her care. The sight of her there, surrounded by color and life, made something twist painfully in his chest. "Penny, for your thoughts," she said without looking up, somehow sensing his presence the way she seemed to sense everything. "Thinking I should probably move on before Morrison comes back with more men." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth, but they needed saying. "I've brought enough trouble to your door." Cordelia's hand stilled among the flowers. When she looked up, her gray eyes were fierce as storm clouds. "Caspian Holt, if you think you're going to run away just when things get interesting, you got another thing coming." "Interesting?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Cordelia, men are going to come hunting me. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come. And when they do, anyone standing near me is going to get hurt." She rose gracefully, brushing dirt from her hands. "You know what I think? I think you're scared. Damn right I'm scared. Scared of what might happen to you if—" "Not scared of dying," she interrupted, stepping closer until he could smell the wildflower perfume in her hair. "Scared of living. Scared of staying in one place long enough to care about something. Scared of what it might mean to stop running and start fighting for something real." Her words hit him like physical blows because they were true. In the 3 days since arriving at the Ashworth homestead, he'd felt more alive than he had in years. Working beside Cordelia in the gardens, listening to Minerva's stories by the fireplace, sleeping in the barn loft with the sounds of home all around him, it had awakened hungers he'd thought dead and buried. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "I'm not a good man, Cordelia. I've done things, seen things that would give you nightmares." "Show me your hands," she commanded. "What? Your hands? Show them to me." Confused, he held out his hands palm up. They were scarred and calloused, marked by years of hard living and harder choices. Not the hands of a gentleman or a saint. Cordelia took them in her smaller ones, tracing the lines and scars with her fingertips. "These are good hands," she said softly. "They've fixed our fence, chopped wood for our fire, been gentle with frightened animals. They helped me plant new flowers yesterday, remember? Held baby rabbits when we found that nest behind the barn." "Cordelia, I'm not finished." Her grip tightened, anchoring him. "These hands have killed, yes, but they've also healed. They've protected. They've cared for things smaller and weaker than themselves. You judge yourself by your worst moment, Caspian, but I see your heart in everything else you do." The setting sun caught in her hair like captured fire, and Caspian felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling. This wild, wonderful girl who spoke to strangers without fear and tended wounded things with infinite patience. had seen straight through to the man he'd been before the world broke him. "I love you," she said simply, the words falling between them like stones in still water. "Don't know when it started, maybe when you worried about bleeding on Ma's floor, maybe when you stood up to Morrison's threats, maybe the first moment I saw you trying to drink away pain that whiskey can't touch. But I love you, Caspian Holt, and I ain't ashamed of it." The world seemed to stop turning. In all his 35 years, through war and peace, through love and loss, no one had ever looked at him the way Cordelia was looking at him now, like he was something precious and worth fighting for. "I'm 15 years older than you," he said weakly. "So? I've got a price on my head. Don't care. I don't even know if I'm capable of the kind of love you deserve." Cordelia smiled then, the expression transforming her face into something that belonged in stained glass windows. "Then I guess you better stick around long enough to find out." Before he could say another word, she rose on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was nothing like the desperate, hungry kisses he'd known in saloons and brothels. This was soft and sweet and full of promise, tasting of wildflowers and hope and all the tomorrows he'd stopped believing in. When they broke apart, Caspian rested his forehead against hers, breathing in her scent and trying to memorize the moment. "I love you too," he whispered, the words falling from his lips like a prayer. "God help me, Cordelia, but I love you more than life itself." "Then fight for me," she whispered back. "Fight for us. Fight for the life we could build together if you're brave enough to believe in second chances." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Caspian Holt made a choice that would change everything. Instead of running from love, he decided to run toward it with all the desperate courage of a man who'd finally found something worth dying for, and more importantly, something worth living for. 2 days later, Sheriff Hawkins arrived with 6 deputized men and a telegram that made Caspian's blood run cold. The wire was from Riverside, signed by the mayor himself. Benjamin Cross's real killer confessed. Caspian Holt cleared of all charges. Bounty rescinded. Send word if found. Sheriff Hawkins, a decent man trapped in an indecent situation, handed Caspian the telegram with obvious relief. "Seems you've been running from ghosts, Holt. Real killer was a gang member named Dutch Cassidy. Got himself shot in a poker game down in El Paso, confessed on his deathbed to shooting Cross in the back." Caspian read the telegram 3 times before. The words sank in. 2 years of running, 2 years of guilt and self-hatred, and it had all been for nothing. He was free legally, if not yet emotionally. "Why are you here then?" Minerva asked from the porch steps, her rifle still within easy reach. Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. "Got a complaint from Jake Morrison about trespassers and stolen property. Says you're harboring criminals and refusing to honor legal debt papers. Morrison's papers are forgeries and you know it," Cordelia said, moving to stand beside Caspian. "Judge Pembroke's been arrested for corruption. Any document bearing his seal is worthless." "That's as may be, miss, but I still got to investigate." Hawkins's words were cut short by the thunder of approaching HOOFBEATS. Jake Morrison rode hard into the yard with a dozen men, his face flushed with triumph. "Sheriff, there's your killer. Bold as brass. I want him arrested for." Morrison's words died as he saw the telegram in Caspian's hands and the relaxed posture of the lawmen. "Actually, Morrison, seems Mr. Holt here is innocent of all charges. Real killer confessed down in Texas." Hawkins's voice carried a note of satisfaction. He'd never liked Morrison's heavy-handed tactics. Morrison's face went through several shades of red before settling on purple. "That don't change nothing. He's still trespassing on my land." "Funny thing about that," came a voice from the road. Judge Samuel Whitmore rode into the yard on a tired horse, his black robes dusty from travel. Behind him came a young clerk carrying a leather satchel bulging with papers. Got word about some questionable land deals in these parts. Thought I'd come investigate personally. Morrison went pale as winter snow. Judge Whitmore had a reputation for honesty that was legendary throughout the territory. The kind of man who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or fooled. "Your Honor," Morrison began. "I was just fraud," Whitmore said calmly, dismounting from Hamel. His horse, plain and simple, had a long talk with Judge Pembroke in federal custody. Amazing how talkative a man gets when he's facing 20 years in prison. Told me all about your little arrangement, forged documents, false debt claims, intimidation. Tactics. The judge's clerk began pulling papers from his satchel. "Jacob Morrison, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, attempted theft, and conspiracy. These papers here prove that Joshua Ashworth paid off all his debts before his death. The land belongs to his widow and daughter, free and clear." Morrison's men, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began backing their horses away from their boss. None of them wanted to face federal charges for a man who'd been caught red-handed. "You can't prove nothing." Morrison snarled, but his voice cracked like a boy's. "Actually, we can." Whitmore smiled grimly. "Amazing what a scared accountant will tell federal marshals when he thinks he's going to hang. Your bookkeeper sang like a canary, Morrison. Every forged document, every illegal foreclosure, every family you've cheated out of their homes." As the deputies moved to arrest Morrison, the man's desperation turned to rage. His hand dropped to his gun, and for a moment the yard balanced. On the knife's edge of violence, Caspian moved with the fluid grace that had made him legendary. His cold-clearing leather before Morrison's gun was half drawn. "I wouldn't," he said quietly. Morrison found himself staring down the barrel of Caspian's gun, death a finger's pressure away. Around him, a dozen other weapons had appeared in the hands of settlers who'd had enough of his bullying. "You're finished." "Morrison," Minerva said, her voice carrying the finality of judgment. "Finished in this county, finished in this territory. Best thing you can do is cooperate with the judge and hope for mercy." The fight went out of Morrison like air from a punctured balloon. His shoulders sagged as the deputies took his guns and snapped iron manacles around his wrists. As they led him away, he looked back at the homestead that had defied him, his pale eyes filled with the bitter knowledge that he'd lost everything. Judge Whitmore handed Minerva a set of official papers. "These should prevent any future questions about your ownership. The federal government is also prepared to offer compensation for the harassment you've endured." As the official party prepared to leave, Sheriff Hawkins paused beside Caspian. "You planning to stick around these parts?" Caspian looked at Cordelia, who was glowing with happiness and relief. "Yes, sir. I believe I am." "Good. Territory needs men like you, ones who stand up for what's right." Hawkins touched his hat brim. "Welcome home, Holt." As the dust settled and peace returned to the Ashworth homestead, Caspian realized that for the first time in years, the word home felt like something he might actually deserve. 6 months later, the wedding took place in the Wildflower Meadow. Behind the Ashworth house, with half the territory in attendance and autumn painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Cordelia wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, with a crown of prairie roses in her wild auburn hair. Caspian stood waiting in his finest clothes, new pants and shirt that Minerva had insisted on buying his face. Clean-shaven and his eyes bright with a happiness that seemed to illuminate him from within. Reverend Matthews, who'd ridden 50 miles to perform the ceremony, spoke of love conquering all obstacles, but Caspian barely heard the words. He was lost in Cordelia's eyes, drowning in the storm-gray depths that had first captured his soul. In Murphy's trading post. "Do you, Caspian Holt, take this woman to be your wife, to love and cherish through all the wild storms and gentle seasons of life?" I do, he said, his voice carrying across the meadow clear as a bell, with everything I am and everything I hope to be. And do you, Cordelia Rose Ashworth, take this man to be your husband, to stand beside him through whatever trails may come? Cordelia's smile was brilliant as sunrise. I do, forever and always, till the stars fall from the sky and the prairie turns to dust. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Caspian kissed his bride with a tenderness that made strong men weep and caused the assembled crowd to cheer loud enough to startle the cattle in the next county. The celebration lasted until dawn, with fiddle music and dancing and enough food to feed a small army. Neighbors who'd barely spoken before found themselves sharing stories and laughter, united by the joy of seeing two wounded souls find healing in each other's arms. As the last guest departed and the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Caspian and Cordelia walked hand in hand through the meadow where they'd pledged their lives to each other. The wildflowers had gone to seed, but their promise of spring renewal seemed to whisper in the gentle wind. No regrets? Cordelia asked, her head resting against his shoulder. Only that it took me so long to find you, Caspian replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I spent so many years running from the past that I almost missed the future. They'd built a small cabin on the hill overlooking the main house, close enough to help Minerva with the ranch work, but far enough away to have privacy for their new marriage. It was a simple place, but it was theirs, the first real home Caspian had known since childhood. Tell me about the babies, Cordelia said, a hint of mischief in her voice. What babies? The ones we're gonna have. At least 6, I'm thinking. Maybe 8. This land needs lots of children to fill it with laughter. Caspian laughed, the sound rich and free. 6 or 8? You planning to kill me with happiness, Mrs. Holt? That's the idea, Mr. Holt. Over the following years, their love story became legend throughout the territory. They had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, all with their mother's wild spirit and their father's steady courage. The Holt Ranch became known for its hospitality, its blooming gardens, and its tradition of taking in strays, both human and animal, who needed healing. Caspian never completely lost his reputation as a dangerous man, but now that danger was channeled into protecting what he loved. He became the unofficial sheriff of their district, the man folks called when trouble threatened their peaceful valley. He was known for his fairness, his quick draw, and his absolute devotion to his wild prairie rose. Cordelia continued to tend her gardens, but now they covered acres of the hillside, a riot of color that could be seen for miles. Travelers would detour just to see the famous flower fields of the Holt Ranch, and many stayed for supper, drawn by Cordelia's laughter and Caspian's quiet stories of redemption. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Cordelia took her husband's scarred hands in hers, the same hands she'd declared good so many years before. Any regrets now? She asked, echoing their wedding night conversation. Caspian looked out over the land they'd built together, the house full of children's laughter, the gardens blooming with impossible beauty, the barn filled with horses, and the sound of Minerva teaching their youngest daughter to play piano. In the distance, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, wild and free and full of promise. Only one, he said, pulling her close as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. What's that? That I can't live this life forever. That someday our story will end. Cordelia smiled and kissed him with all the fierce tenderness that had saved his soul in a dusty trading post so long ago. Stories like ours don't end, Caspian Holt. They just become legends, and legends ... legends live forever. As night settled over their beloved prairie, the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow. Somewhere in the darkness, a meadowlark sang its ancient song of hope, and two hearts that had found each other against all odds beat in perfect rhythm, wild and free and utterly, completely whole. Their love had conquered death, distance, and despair. It had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, survived bullets and betrayal and the weight of impossible odds. And in the end, it had proven what Cordelia had always known, that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is open their heart to a stranger and ask, "You look tired, Mr. Want to meet my ma?" For in that simple question lay the seed of every great love story. The courage to see past the surface to the wounded soul beneath, and the faith to believe that even the most broken heart can bloom again when tended with enough patience, kindness, and wild, untamed love.